Now that's going to have an effect, not only for every person who eats, but for every farmer on the planet, because this is a major source for production. And how the rest of us who are not living in the heartland of the United States going to produce enough food to feed the human population? These are all the kinds of issues that we have to think about and have to address. Now, the other issue here, which isn't specifically an old calorie issue, but it comes out of the way we've used our old calories in this neocaloric era, is climate change. And, wherever you are all at, and I'm the first person to recognize, you can prove, for example, that the hurricane disaster that we just had in New York, where I was at this past weekend, was caused by climate change. The one thing that we do know, and every climate scientist is telling us this, is that we're seeing more of those kinds of weather events. And so I don't know who first came up with coining the phrase global weirdness, but that's really what we're facing. It's not global warming, it's global weirdness. And every one of you as a farmer knows that in the last analysis, the success of your farm is going to be dependent on the weather more than anything else. We all know that, right? And so again, this is part of the future that we're going to have to be facing. So what I've said to the young family that's managing our farm in North Dakota for us now, I said, look, we got to think about the future here. And so I want you to think about, with me, let's imagine, let's assume that 10 years from now, crude oil will be $300 a barrel. And let's assume we have twice as many severe weather events. Now help me figure out what we're going to put on the landscape in order to make our farm resilient. Now, I know that seems like a very foreboding kind of thing, but that's really what we have to think about. And you may think that $300 a barrel 10 years from now is a little extreme, we won't get there. Well, even if it's 20 years from now, do we have time to make the kind of changes that we need to make in 20 years? And T. Boone Pickens, who was an oil guy, right, from Texas, he in fact said 2 years ago that we should expect that crude oil will be at $350 a barrel in 10 years. So that's only 8 years from now. So these are the issues that we have to address and think about. Now, unfortunately, at the same time that we have become so dependent on these old calories in this neocaloric era, we have not paid attention to the ecological health and the social health of our systems. So we have not, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we have not paid any attention to the biological health of our soil. And that's one of the critical resources as we think about, this question mark line now of what kind of agriculture system we're going to put in place in the future. Restoring the biological health of our soil is not the only thing that we've got to do, but it's a critical piece. We now know from research, for example, that if you have 1% organic matter in your soil, the soil has the capacity to absorb and retain about 33 pounds of water per cubic yard. But if you have 5% organic matter, it's 195 pounds. Now, every farmer knows you can't get all soil to go from 1% organic matter to 5% organic matter, but we can improve organic matter. We can improve the health of all soil. And everybody who's an organic farmer that's done this for a number of years has seen this happen on their own farms. We know this can happen. But we currently are not investing in this. There isn't, in the United States, there isn't any program at USDA that pays farmers to restore the biological health of their soil, or that incentivizes them to do that. That's one of the things we have to do. A second ecological resource that we've not paid attention to is the biodiversity and genetic diversity of our farms. In fact, we've gone in the opposite direction. And the reason that we have is because in this neocaloric era, the sole goal was maximum efficient production for short-term economic return, right? That's what everybody is, whether you're an organic farmer or a conventional farmer, that's what you have to do. Because if you don't do that, it's understood you're going to be out of business. Now, if you're going to work, if your goal is going to be maximum efficient production for short-term economic return, how are you going to do that? You're going to specialize because you get more efficiencies. You're going to find ways to simplify your management because that increases your efficiency. And you're going to go for economies of scale. And so that's the reason why when you drive across the state of Iowa now, the only thing that you hardly ever see in any farmer's field is corn and soybeans. That's the specialization. And in the animal system, about the only thing you see is animals in confinement operations because that's part of the specialization and the efficiency. It's worked very well up to now. But when our energy costs start to go up, when all of these other resources, these old calories that we've depended upon are gone, I can tell you it's not going to work that well anymore. And again, there was an example of this already happening in an article that was written by a cooperative extension agent from Oklahoma. Just this last week, published the article pointing out that feedlot operations, cattle feedlot operations now are in serious trouble in the United States, and in fact, one has already announced that they're going to close in Kansas. And the reason is because with the drought, here's where the combination of things start to come in. With the drought, farmers have had to sell a lot of their breeding stock because they didn't have the feed to feed their animals, so the number of calves coming in the feedlots now is going down, so they don't have the volume that they needed in the past. And the cost of feed, of course, is going up, so they've got this increased cost, and they just can't afford to do it anymore. Now, feedlots aren't the only thing in this current neocaloric era, the way that we're operating, that's going to be in trouble. Yeah. And so, again, we have to think about how we're going to do this. And the biodiversity and the genetic diversity is also a critical part of this. Biological health of our soil. And we have, with this specialization, we have lost roughly half of a third of our animal breeds and almost 70% of our crop varieties, because we focused everything on the specialization, right? So, seed breeders don't want to develop a seed that's locally adapted to every local ecology in the world. They want to develop a seed that they can sell everywhere in the world. And so it gives us that kind of specialization. And again, as long as we have all these subsidizations of these old calories to support it, it worked relatively well, as we all know, but it's not the future. Now, the other resource that we're losing in all of this, which is going to be a critical, well, there's two, but there's one that particularly, I think, should be of concern to all of us in this room, and that's the human capital, namely the farmers. Now, I don't know the statistics in Canada, so I'm just going to share with you the statistics in the United States, and I would suspect that in Canada they're roughly similar. We, in the United States, we do an ag census every 5 years. So we get a number of how many farmers we have and about the whole system of agriculture. And our last census data was in 2007. The next one is in 2012, of course, but it won't become available until sometime in 2013, so we don't have those numbers yet. But in 2007, there was a lot of euphoria in the United States because we went from 2.1 million farmers to 2.2 million farmers. And all of the journalists said, wow, this is great, we've got an increase of farmers, and this is wonderful, etc. But nobody paid any attention to the definition of how we come up with a farm. There was only one journalist that I know of that actually picked up on that, and the reason she did was because she happens to be a friend of mine, and I told her she had to talk to Mike Duffy, who's an ag economist at Iowa State University, who's been tracking this since 1980. And he's always been concerned about the definition that we do because it's misleading the public. And so her name is Lisa Hamilton. So she started out her op-ed saying, so from 2.1 million farms to 2.2 million farms, that seems really great, but nobody's asking what a farm is. And then she gives the definition of a farm, which is a definition that we've been using since 1974, USDA. And that is any place that produces $1,000 in gross sales, or would have produced $1,000 in gross sales if that place had maximized its full production capacity. So Lisa Hamilton says, so that's interesting, I live in a suburban community and I have 4 chickens in my backyard, and if I really maximize the full production capacity of those 4 chickens, I can produce $500 worth of eggs. So all I need is 4 more chickens on the farm. Now, this is not to demonize the small farmers. As far as I'm concerned, if somebody produces $500 worth of good food and brings it into a farmer's market to sell it, I want to honor them as farmers. But we have to help the public understand what's actually happening to our farming population, because that's going to be critical, particularly as we face these new challenges now as we move beyond the neocaloric era. We're going to need some of the most imaginative, dedicated, inspiring farmers that we've ever had in our history. And where we are right now, when you break those statistics down as of 2007, 75% of our total agricultural sales in the United States were produced by just 192,442 farms. And 30% of our farmers are now over age 65, and only 6% are under age 35. Now, if that doesn't scare you, it scares me in terms of this human capital that we're going to need on the ground with the wisdom and the courage and the imagination to address these new challenges in the future. And I'm not going to go into this, but you all know this too, that the other thing that's happened, of course, is the deterioration of our human communities in all of this, because, you know, as we've insisted that our farmers have to get bigger, get out, and have to specialize and go for economies of scale and all of that, you know, our rural communities have shrunk, and so the kind of social support system that's been there for our farmers and our rural communities has been deteriorating, and we can go into that more this afternoon if we want. So now, you know, I'm sure this is enough gloom and doom to discourage you, but one of the things that we need to look at here now is, so where do we go from here now? So what is this question mark now, the next line, beyond the near caloric era? What are we going to do? How are we going to put our food system together? Well, currently there are two stories about how to address that. And I'm not going to go into detail here, and we can do this afternoon. But the one story is, well, what we have to do is we have to intensify what we've been doing, because what we've been doing has been so successful, so we simply got to do more of it. So we come up with the new technologies, we'll have the farms getting bigger and more efficient, etc., and we'll be able to feed 9 billion people in 2050, which is basically where the story's framed, right? Okay, so that's one story. The other story is now an increasing number of people who are saying, wait a minute, granted, this has been successful over the last 100 years or so in agriculture, but given the new challenges that we're facing, and given these deteriorations that we've seen in soil, biodiversity, etc., we've got to fundamentally redesign the system. It's not, and even if you think about this now, as we're with all of this that we're doing, we're feeding the world. But as we know, on a global basis, we still have almost 1 billion people who are going hungry. So we're not solving the problem. But nevertheless, so you have those two stories out there. Now, if you think about how this is all going to, here's a little bit more bad news. I'll get to the good news in a second. But Michael Clare has just published a new book called The Race for What? The Race for What's Left. And he makes a very compelling case that the direction that we're going to go in now is that every country is going to get into a race to hang on to the resources that it has to make the system work a little bit longer. So Canada, for example, which has still one of the largest reserves of potassium, you're going to hang on to the potassium and use that to your political advantage in the way you can. Russia, which has still the largest reserves of rock phosphate, they're going to be politically positioning themselves, etc. And so we could very easily get into this kind of future. We're going to be a future of resource wars. Now that's the most stupid thing that we could possibly do as a human family in the community, because if we use the more resources of these remaining resources that we have, fighting for the resources we've got less, the rest resources we're going to have to redesign and make the transition into the future. But nevertheless, that's one possible scenario that I think all of us have to really be extremely careful that we not allow ourselves to move in that kind of direction.